Recall that it is a criteria of a living cell to acquire energy from outside sources, to obtain and use energy. Plants are able to do this by harnessing the energy of the sun, while animals consume other organisms and acquire their energy. This leads us to two terms, autotrophs versus heterotrophs. Autotrophs, auto, meaning self, are able to sustain themselves without eating any other organism. Heterotrophs, hetero meaning others, means they obtain their organic material, their energy resources, by consuming and capitalizing on another organism's work. The significance of this is that we can see the laws of thermodynamics at play here. Energy is transferred through organisms within the system, and we can trace these relationships in the energy gained and lost between levels. When considering metabolism, it's important to point out the primary energy molecule, adenosine triphosphate, or ATP for short. Adenosine triphosphate is a short-lived molecule that is constantly being converted to ATP and then consumed, generating ADP, D for diphosphate, having only two phosphates, which is quickly regenerated into ATP. And so it's this constant flux between ADP to ATP that creates energy for us to use, and then that energy is consumed, recreating ADP. All of our energy is packed into that third phosphate bond. When that bond breaks, energy is released, and we can run, jump, leap, and play. But because of the nature of atoms and wanting to combine to get their valence shell filled, that inorganic phosphate that's released from ADP will quickly rebind, creating a continuous source of renewable energy. As we build upon our understanding of chemical reactions, it's important to highlight that when bonds are breaking and reforming, what we're really doing is following the movement of electrons. So all chemical reactions are really a series of oxidation and reduction, or redox reactions. When something is oxidized, it is losing an electron, losing a hydrogen, or gaining an oxygen, hence the name. And this means that it finds itself in a higher energy state. You can recognize oxidized components by whether they've lost electrons and hydrogens or gained an oxygen. And to determine that, you look at the equation and see what's changed from left to right. Because equations are balanced, when something is oxidized, another thing in the reaction will be reduced. The reduced participant will gain the electron, becoming more negative, hence the name reduced, or gain a hydrogen, or have lost the oxygen. In either case, being more close to its valence shell electrons, it will generally be at a lower energy state moving forward. As we move forward, be able to recognize the oxidized participant from the reduced participant in a reaction. Two mnemonics that could help you with this are oil rig or Leo the Lion says grr. Pick the one that resonates with you and then try to apply the key features of oxidation versus reduction in these following practice items. Animal cells go through a process known as respiration. This takes place in the mitochondria. You might recall this is the powerhouse of the cell. The ability to generate energy really comes from the shape and structure of the mitochondria. It has an inner matrix and large folds known as the cristae, which will allow it to participate in different chemical reactions and invest and store a potential energy gradient for later use. The chemical reaction of cell respiration can be broken down or described as the breakdown of food molecules, namely glucose, but the breakdown of molecules produced by photosynthesis, carbs and sugars to produce ATP, energy. Cell respiration takes place over 4 phases. Cell respiration can occur aerobically or anaerobically. Aerobic respiration occurs when the cell has ample access to oxygen. Anaerobic reactions occur when oxygen is limited. How can you tell if a pathway is an aerobic one versus an anaerobic one? You count the oxygens on the left versus the oxygens on the right of the equation. If they're even, the reaction can occur anaerobically with no additional oxygen required. If they're uneven, the cell or the organism would have to take a deep breath in to bring additional oxygens. Keeping that in mind, try to identify the following reactions as aerobic versus anaerobic. The first phase, glycolysis, occurs in the cytoplasm. Every cell from the lowly amoeba to the complex human cell can do this. It takes glucose and involves bond breaking to form two pyruvates, also known as pyruvic acid. These pyruvates then go on into the mitochondrial matrix to participate in the prep reaction. The pyruvates are then cleaved to form acetyl. Acetyl then participates in another chemical reaction known as the citric acid cycle or Krebs cycle, still taking place in the mitochondrial matrix. This time, the process involves bond making to form citric acid or citrate and some other ATP energy. Finally, the electron transport chain occurs. This takes place across the mitochondrial cristae, the folds within the mitochondria. And this reaction takes NADH and FADH2. These are lesser known energy molecules and converts them to the primary energy molecule, ATP. As cell respiration was occurring in the prior phases of glycolysis and the prep reaction and the citric acid cycle, these lesser known energies were being formed. The electron transport chain then takes these lesser known energies and converts them to the ideal and generates the most energy bang for our buck. The mitochondria is able to do this through a process known as chemiosmosis. The electron transport chain rips off hydrogens, creating an intermembrane space that's chock full of potential energy. And then a rotor and channel opens, allowing those hydrogens to move from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration spontaneously. And as they do so, they do with gusto because of that high gradient. And this turns the rotor, generating energy and forming our ATP. In order for our muscles to work, they need a ready supply of oxygen. This is why when you're undergoing high intensity exercise, you find yourself seeking for more and more breath because the action has depleted our oxygen. Our bodies needed a way to provide additional energy despite this low oxygen availability. Our backup plan is fermentation. This provides a last burst of ATP energy despite having less or no free oxygen available. But like all backup plans, it is a compromise. The byproduct of fermentation is lactic acid. This is toxic, and it's one of the factors that result in our muscle soreness that we feel after an intense or long workout. Fermentation takes place in the cytosol, and it repurposes the pyruvate that would otherwise go to the mitochondria and go through the prep reaction, citric acid cycle, and electron transport chain to convert that into lactic acid in animal cells or ethanol in plant cells. In doing so, it generates a little bit of energy despite not having available oxygen. A cell that goes through glycolysis and fermentation will form some energy. It's not nearly as efficient, but it does have its role. It allows us to push through a little bit further, and that could mean all the difference in life or death. And understanding fermentation has had massive implications and applications commercially in preserving food, processing food, and creating biodiesel. One thing to notice is that in both cases of photosynthesis and cell respiration, there was the term cycle. And so it's important to point out that chemical reactions can occur either linearly or cyclically. Linear reactions are one-way streets, but cyclical reactions come full circle Half the reaction forms the product, and the second half of the reaction regenerates the starting material. Photosynthesis uses the Calvin cycle, and chemical energy of ATP and lesser-known energies of NADPH are used to reduce the carbon dioxide to form sugar. That's the first half of the reaction. The second half of the reaction is to regenerate rubisco, our electron acceptor and key player in this reaction. Cell respiration, on the other hand, uses the citric acid cycle, where the chemical energy of ATP is used to reduce acetyl to form citrate and coenzyme A. So the first half of the reaction forms citrate, the primary product of the Krebs cycle, while the second half of the reaction reforms coenzyme A. I highlight this because cycles have value in biology, for when we remake the starting material, we create a more energy efficient reaction. Respiration is almost the flip side to this. Sugars come in and glycolysis takes place in the cytoplasm. When oxygen is available, the pyruvate moves into the mitochondrial matrix and participates in the prep reaction and the citric acid cycle, and the byproducts of that go through an electron transport chain to create a gradient that generates a lot of ATP.